Without further ado, I present Dr. Christopher Bell with today's message, What Confucius Said.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. We're going to take a moment to move this up front, if that's okay. As long as I don't break it. There we go.
It needs to go back a little bit.
Okay. That's my desktop.
Turn these lights out. These two lights are switch in there. Get them. I wonder if we can turn these two phones off. Switch in there.
That's pretty strange.
They're right here. Oh!
Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Okay. Kind of prefer just to talk to you one-on-one, if that's okay. Can everyone hear me okay?
Almost.
Almost. Should I use this? Is that better? Okay, I'll use that then. Well, thank you again for having me here. It's great to be back on this lovely morning. Isn't it gorgeous outside? Let's hope it keeps up. I'm here today to talk to you about Confucianism, and before I get started on that, I do need to set some context on some of the terms. I'll also be passing around an example or sample of sort of traditional Chinese writing, and we'll also be reciting some Chinese, if that's okay with everyone in the audience, just to sort of actually say something that Confucius presumably actually said, although we can talk about that a little bit later. You know what, I'll actually start off by passing that out now. There we go. Actually, I'll give a little context first. So for one thing, just by raise of hands, who's heard of Confucius before? Yeah. At least in those very popular jokes like what Confucius said, right? Yeah, it's very popular. So we'll find out what he actually said, at least that we know to the best of our ability. Who's heard of the Analects? Is that phrase? Oh, not too many people. Okay. So what I mean by the Analects is really just the sayings of Confucius, although I'll deconstruct that term a little bit as we get close to it. Before I do that, I would like to set up some of the context in which Confucianism developed, because it's very much situated within the ancient history of China. Before we get to that, let me ask you, by raise of hand, who would say Confucianism is a religion? If you raise your hand if you agree with that. And then who would say it's a philosophy? Oh, so most of you, okay. We'll dissect that too. I'll ask again maybe at the end of this presentation or maybe in the other room, because that's a very slippery slope, and it has a lot to do with how we in the West or we in America define religion versus philosophy and how Chinese traditionally do. They're very interrelated. So for one thing is this word religion is very intriguing. Usually the word used to translate religion today in Chinese is this word right here, pronounced 宗教, 宗教, which literally means school of teaching. And because it has that very institutional character, it can lead to a lot of confusion. So a lot of censuses, when they ask Chinese if they're religious, will use this word, which is why I think this has been fixed in recent times, but certainly a decade or more ago, it was often the perception that Chinese were not religious, right? Chinese were maybe atheist, and certainly communism didn't help with that, that perception. But in fact, asking Chinese if they're religious using this word almost is like asking, are you a priest? Or are you a monk? or a nun. So it has this institutional character, and naturally, just like in the States, I think, just like anywhere in the world, most people will not answer affirmative to that question, right? Are you a priest? No, probably not. So the tombs tend to be on these lovely hillsides far, far away. It's a bit of a trek. But you will have these memorial centers, and I've been to the one for Popo, for my girlfriend's grandmother, that'll be right in the middle of the city. And you can go there and you can make offerings to the deceased right there. So you'll see the offerings right below, and I took all these there, these pictures, but you'll make offerings of food, of nice fruit. You'll make offerings of incense. You'll often have 3 sticks of incense that you'll light, and then you'll stand in front of the photo of your relative, and you'll bow 3 times like so. Very formalized. Oftentimes, what food you give them is dependent on their appetite or what they liked in life. So I know that Popo was a big fan of wonton min, which is basically wonton noodle soup. And so we would pick up a bowl of that and take it there and leave it there, you know, for her to enjoy, presumably. So there are all these memorial altars that are also within easier access of living family members to pay their respects and to make offerings. Any questions about that? Kind of intriguing. So this is all tied into Confucianism at large, right? It's a form of filial piety in its kind of deepest sense. I'll kind of breeze through these last things. I really just want to mention 2 very famous Confucians. So don't worry about reading any of this. This is just sort of extra information. But 2 really famous Confucians, after Confucius himself actually passed, are Mencius. Has anyone heard of Mencius? No? 1 or 2? Okay, good. So Mencius, he's probably the most famous Confucian. His actual Chinese name is Mengzi. Just like Confucius, Confucian is the Latinized name for Confucius. And even that is a little bit of an Anglicization. I don't know if that's a word. Jesuits kind of made that name up. His actual name, Confucius's actual name or title was Kongzi. Kongzi. Zi means master. So Kong is his surname. And Chinese often puts the surname first and then the personal name second. So Kongzi literally means Master Kong. Right? Master Kong. In the same sense, Mencius is the Latinized Mengzi, meaning Master Monk. That being his surname, not his personal name, so his last name. And he lived a good century or so after Confucius passed. His major contribution, I'll just say simply, is that he sort of philosophized the ethical concerns of Confucianism. His major issue was that humans were innately good, he thought. Mencius thought that humans were by nature good. His opponent, living about 100 years after him, is a fellow named Shunzi, and he argued that people were innately bad, that people were innately evil. So you have these 2 very, very famous Confucian scholars arguing from very different perspectives on the very nature of humanity. Are we good or are we bad? Raise your hand if you agree with Mencius that humans are innately good. That's going to be most people. Raise your hand if you think Shunzi was right and people are innately bad. No one's going to admit that. Huh? And certainly, what?
I just never believe that.
You never believe, exactly. So, and that's certainly a later conundrum. Is that even accurate to ask if people are one or the other? Are they a mix of both, or is it a blank slate? And it just depends on your upbringing, right? We tend to, I think, in our society, side, if we had to pick one, with Mencius, in that people can be reformed. And that's what he believed, that Confucian teaching, basically he thought that society ruined people, Mencius. It kind of got us away from our true good selves, and Confucianism was there to remind us. Whereas Shunzi said, no, Confucianism is there to correct us. And subtle difference there. People are innately evil, and Confucianism keeps us in check. Right? So those are the major differences between those 2. So they added a major philosophical layer to Confucianism. And then finally, from the Han Dynasty on, from about 2,000 years ago onward, Confucianism was heavily tied in with the state. The imperial cult, as it's called, and I mean cult here as a locus of worship, would include Confucius in their registers, so that he himself, in some ways, became sort of like a god of scholarship. So you see here students at this university in China today, or not long ago, 2011 is when this photo was taken, revering Confucius, praying to him for good favors on the exams. Right? So Confucius himself becomes a little bit apotheosized or deified in a sense. And from that time on, a lot of religious elements start to get included in Confucian practice, especially from about 1,000 years ago. Buddhist and Taoist metaphysical concepts, like the great cosmic Tao in Taoism, start to infiltrate Confucian thought in a sense, start to become just as much a part of that. And this is one of the reasons why Chinese religion in general can be very difficult to study, because it's very blurry what is Buddhist, what is Confucian, what is Taoist, because they're so intertwined in actual practice. Popular Chinese religion really incorporates all of these elements. They worship Confucius, they'll worship Buddha, they'll worship Taoist gods. And it's not like there's anything exclusive, right? It's not like they can only focus on one and not the others. They'll take it all. So it can make it very difficult to distinguish between them sometimes. Okay. I think that's really it. I want to save this moment. I'll leave it up there for now, but I do want to save this for when we talk in the other room, because this dives a bit more into what the analogs actually are and who composed them. So I'll save that for now. So I'll end on just where Confucianism is today in China. It was very much heavily involved in the imperial examination system, which is a Chinese invention extending at least as far back as the Han Dynasty, and where we get our own ideas of standardized testing from. It's actually Chinese. It's from this system. So anybody who has taken the SATs or anyone who has children or grandchildren you can thank China. That ended officially in China, the imperial exams, in 1905, a little over a century ago. And since then, modernization has happened. There's been a lot of history going on. In terms of Confucius, now, what's really interesting is during the Cultural Revolution, it was thought of as a religion by the communist Politburo. So it was heavily stigmatized and criticized by the communists. Since then, it's been referred to as a philosophy, and oftentimes you go into bookstores in China or even in Hong Kong and Taiwan, books on Confucianism will be found in the philosophy section, and books on Buddhism and Taoism will be found in the religion section. And there's a little bit of politics behind that, because by calling it a philosophy, now communist officials can revere Confucian teachings, can sort of be part of this popular reinvention or reinvigoration of it without necessarily saying that it's religious, right? That they're religious. So there's a little bit of politics behind calling something religion or not a religion, philosophy or not, whereas traditionally in China, there's very blurred distinctions between the two. Oftentimes they were one and the same, just depending on what you focused on. All right, and I'll leave it at that. So today, Confucianism more or less in China is thought of as a philosophy, but we know better. It's more complex. So now, to end on the same question I started with, knowing what you know now, raise your hand if you think Confucianism is a religion. Still on the raise it if you think it's philosophy. Still a majority. Okay, good. Well, it's okay. The Chinese would agree with you today. Any final questions? All right, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Some are, certainly, but that's going to be a very small minority. And so it has to be worded a little bit differently. When we do actually ask Chinese, do you believe something? Do you believe in Buddha? Do you believe in the teachings of Confucius? Do you believe in the Tao? Then we get more affirmative answers. And in that regard, practically all Chinese answer in the affirmative. Right? And that's when we get these three major traditions that sort of encompass Chinese belief and practice today. That's Confucianism, which we'll talk about today, often called Rujiao, the teachings of the scholars. There's Taoism, Daojiao, the teachings of the Way, and we'll talk about the Tao because it's also important in Confucianism. And then, of course, Buddhism, Fujiao, the teachings of the Buddha. Okay, so these are the three major traditions in Chinese religious practice, and still very prevalent today. All right, but we're going to talk about Confucianism. Okay, so I hope this isn't too daunting. You don't have to memorize any of this. I'm not going to quiz you on it, I promise. But this is just to give you a little bit of historical context for when Confucianism comes about. The only really important period is this one. spring and autumn, really on the cusp of the Warring States period, because that's when that's when Confucius lived. And so we have all of these periods in ancient Chinese history. We're talking like 4,000 years ago for the Xia dynasty period, which is kind of semi-mythical. The Shang dynasty, we get a bit more historical context. And finally, the Zhou dynasty is the real sort of ancient golden age of China. And it's within the Zhou dynasty we have this further division of Western and Eastern that has to do with where the capitals were. So again, nothing you have to really know. And within the Eastern Zhou, we have this further subdivision of the spring and autumn period, the first half of that, which was thought of as this sort of golden, perfect, utopian age. And then things started to fall apart during, very aptly named, the Warring States period, when all these different principalities sort of became their own individual kingdoms and started fighting with each other and started trying to take each other's land and resources, and there was a lot of strife and conflict. Confucius lived at the very tail end of the spring and autumn period in the Eastern Zhou dynasty. So he died really within the couple of years of that transition. So we kind of saw things changing for the worse. And a lot of his teachings tend to reflect that. And I'll talk about that. And then finally, when the Warring States period ended, it was because one of those states, the Qin state, won out. They basically took over everyone else in the end. And that's actually where we get our word China from. Qin, China, is the way it's referred to. You still hear me? So that's why we call it China. And then that didn't last very long. The Qin dynasty didn't last very long at all. And then it became the Han dynasty. That, by far, was the longest dynasty in Chinese history and is sort of the new golden age of Chinese thought, to the point where even today we tend to use the ethnonym, the ethnic name for Chinese, as Han Chinese. So that's about 2,000 years ago, give or take 200 years. So that's when that period is. So what we're looking at really is going to be this part right here, the spring and autumn period. Any questions? You ready to practice some of that Chinese? Yeah? Okay. So here's something that Confucius actually said. It's probably a little bit. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So what this, I'm going to recite it. I know it's a bunch of characters right now for you, but this is the original Chinese of one such saying. The actual English here translated is, when the nobleman deals with the world, he is not prejudiced for or against anything. He does what is right. And the Chinese, and I'll say it bit by bit, and then you can repeat after me, 2 or 3 syllables at a time. So the Chinese is, well, I'll say it all one, and then you can repeat after me. So the full saying is, 众子之于天下也，无始也，无我也，依之于彼. Okay, so we'll go by that bit by bit. You ready? Okay, more or less. Okay. No. Okay. All right. So that first word is 君子. 君子. Yep. 之于天下也，无始也，无我也。Perfect. 依之于彼. There you go. You actually said what Confucius said. All right, well done. And how that actually translates, that very first word is important, because 君子 means gentleman and nobleman, as it's translated here. And then it sort of goes into the nobleman who deals with the world is not for or against anything. And so there's the sort of being preferential or prejudiced for or against anything. Instead, he is concerned with what is righteous. Right? That's the literal meaning of that, bit by bit. And this is definitely one of the sections. This is in chapter 4 of the Analects, verse 10. Definitely one of the sections that most scholars would agree Confucius actually said. And again, when we talk after the service, we'll go into the nitty-gritty of how much of the Analects was actually composed or spoken by Confucius. So I'll go ahead and start passing this around now, and then we can kind of get into what the Analects were actually concerned with. So the way that this is sort of traditionally divided is there's about 5 chapters for each of these sections. I'll pass out 2, 1 for each side. And if you flip through it, and I do ask you to be a little bit careful, you can't get these on Amazon. I picked these up in Xi'an, China, which was one of the ancient capitals. You flip through it, it's very much sort of the traditional Chinese, which was written top to bottom, not left to right or right to left, top to bottom. And from there, then it was right to left, not left to right like we're familiar with. So you would read it, you would start right here, which was at the back of the book, and you would open it up, and as you did, then you would start reading from the inside out. And then you'd flip, and then you'd keep going, you'd start over here and keep going. And there's even some really nice pictures in this cup, so this is a really nice addition. So I'll pass out 2 of the booklets that came with this. Alrighty. So as for who Confucius himself was, we actually have very little reliable information on him. We know that he existed, which is more than we can say for some other individuals. Has anyone heard of the Tao Te Ching, the major text of Taoism? So that was, by tradition, thought to have been composed by a fellow named Lao Tzu. But we're pretty sure he didn't exist. That text was probably written by multiple people, as was the Analects, in fact. But we do know that at least some of it was composed by Confucius, and that Confucius actually existed. What we do know about him is indeed that he lived at the very tail end, and those are his dates, about 2,500 years ago, at the tail end of the spring and autumn period, that he was born and raised in a state called Lu state, and that he became a government bureaucrat, and that was his job most of his life, that he worked in the Lu state bureaucracy. And then when he retired, he started to teach. So it was only in his later age that he became renowned as a great teacher, and certainly renowned for his scholarship. His main concern, seeing the slow sort of degradation of society happening around him, is that he wanted to improve society through ethical reform. And this is definitely a big characteristic of the Analects, is that it's very ethical. It's very ethically oriented. It's all about morality, all about proper conduct, all about proper behavior. Very, very big. And it's significant because this is still very important to Chinese today. It took a major hit during the Cultural Revolution of the 60s and 70s, but now especially, it's really coming back into vogue. And there are some scholars, very famous scholars, Yu Dan, she's one major one, who were bringing Confucianism back to the public in China and making it very popular again. So it's always kind of been around, even when it's been unpopular. According to tradition, he traveled in his retirement far and wide across different states to talk to different kings, to different bureaucrats, different scholars, in order to try to bring others over to his point of view. He never really succeeded in bringing kings to his point of view, but he definitely started to develop a following from these various states, and many of those individuals later became his own students. And then they had students who followed suit from those teachings as well. He was often known as the model teacher for all ages because he founded this school in Lu later in life that taught Confucian ethic and reform. But here's the important thing to note about Confucius. He wasn't thinking he was saying anything new, right? He wasn't saying, as far as he was concerned, anything unique. For him, it was about regaining or returning to the way that society used to be. There was this golden age, the early Zhou dynasty, that Confucius says we can return to that great time of social utopia. And my teachings are really just getting us back there. This is what they used to do. This is what they used to think and believe and act and behave as far as he was concerned. And we just need to remember that again. So that was his big concern. He didn't think of his teachings as anything new or unique. He just thought of it as reminding people the way that things used to be and trying to get to that point again. All right, as for the text that I passed out, at least portions of, because the other 2 copies are right here, it was compiled over about a 200-year period, a little bit more than that, from about 475 to 221 BCE. And by BCE, I just mean BC. And now that just means before the Common Era, rather than before Christ, but it's the same numbers. And a lot of these are just maxims believed to be spoken by Confucius himself, much like the one that we recited together, all about how to be a proper noble person, all right, doing what is right, avoiding what is wrong, rather than doing what you want to do and avoiding what you hate. Right? That was his big concern. He also, this text, the actual text of the Analects, did contain some of Confucius' own teachings, and again, the example I gave is one such example, but it also incorporated interpretations and teachings by his own disciples, sort of said in his own words. And this tended to be very popular not only in ancient China, but in the ancient world in general, where the teachings of a famous disciple or a later disciple were thought to be that of the actual teacher. Right? So not uncommon in the ancient world. And most of these teachings, as I said, were mainly concerned with social propriety and moral conduct. And again, the main goal was to regain the way. Here's that word again, the way, here translating the Chinese Tao. Right? So the same Tao that you find in Tao Te Ching, that you find in the teachings of Taoism, is just as popular, just as important in Confucianism. The difference is, and it's a subtle one, is that the way that Tao, which literally means the way that is understood has much more social connotation in Confucianism. It is the right way to act in society, right? The way that society should be. And those are the whole point of his teachings. Try to achieve that ancient golden age of the Zhou dynasty. Society needs to return to that proper way of acting. In Taoism, Tao takes on a much more cosmic connotation, if you're curious about the distinction, so that the way has a much more cosmic or metaphysical understanding. It is the way of the universe, the way of nature in Taoism. Whereas in Confucianism, it is the way of society, the way of proper conduct. Is that clear? So the main way that Confucius argued for us to get back to the proper way of society, the proper way of conducting ourselves, is that we need to return to the proper label of things. He basically saw everyone abusing their own titles, not only in office, but in relationship to their own families. And so he proposed what he called a rectification of names. Basically, if you are a father, if you are a ruler, if you are a wife or a child, then you need to act in accordance to what is expected of those labels. And there was an implied understanding of what was expected of you with those labels. And for Confucius, it especially began with the family. Right? Confucianism is all about starting with the family and going big. Taoism is going to do the opposite. Taoism is going to start with the ruler and go down. So Confucius had a very much of a bottom-up approach. If the family is acting right, that'll act as a good model, right? A good example for the village. The entire village will act appropriate. That village will act as a model to all other villages. And then the entire kingdom will act appropriate, and the king will follow suit. So he had this vision of, we start small, and it'll create this rippling effect and expand throughout entire society. And the way to do that is everyone, starting with the family, acts according and appropriate to who they are. So you have, and it's very much a hierarchical relationship here. The ruler and the subject is one of these 5 relationships that he talked about. The ruler has to act as a just ruler, and the subject has to abide by the ruler. You have husband and wife, very traditional, where the husband, it says what goes, and the wife follows the husband. You have the parentage to the child, where the child does what the parent says, acts filial, acts respectfully, and the parent takes care of the child. So it's a little bit symbiotic. You have older and younger siblings, where the older siblings have the authority over the younger siblings. And then finally, the one relationship that's a bit more mutual, friend to friend. Right? In that sense, everyone has sort of equal status, but is beholden to one another in terms of friendship. All right? So again, family is the very root of society. And this picture, by the way, is a Chinese movie that came out about 4 or 5 years ago on Confucius, where Confucius is played by the actor Chow Yun-fat. Has anyone heard of Chow Yun-fat? He kind of made it big in the West as well. It's a bit of an epic, melodramatic movie. It takes some liberties with the original story of Confucius, but it's entertaining nonetheless. All right, as for what the Analects actually say, if we look at the major themes in the various teachings in there, in the various verses, again, one of the major ones is this concept called 君子, which refers to a nobleman, or, it did have definitely a male connotation, but if we broaden it to any superior person, to how an ideal person in society as a social being is supposed to act. Right? And again, tied into that is being selfless, not concerned about what you enjoy or what you disdain, but rather what is right versus what is wrong by traditional understanding. So being a just or upright person, as we could understand 君子 here, was very, very central to the teachings of the Analects. We also have this concept, these two very key concepts in Chinese are 仁 and 礼. 仁 is often translated as benevolence, and is exactly the internal activity or mental state of such a 君子, such a noble person. So this is someone, an internal expression of Confucian ideals, someone who embodies proper conduct in their person. Right? You can almost think of it as morality. And then ritual propriety, or li, this is the external expression of those Confucian ideals. So if you are a just person, if you are a righteous person, then your social conduct will reflect that. That's the ideal anyway. So you will act according to your status with other people of like or superior or inferior status. You will perform various ritual expectations of you, both in your family, in your village, within the society or empire at large. All of this is tied in with this concept of li, or ritual propriety. Very, very strong ethical implications behind this. So it's not just religious ritual, although that is part of it. It is also social ritual. The two are very, very intertwined. Again, this concept of the Tao, or the way, a social paradigm with cosmic undertones. There was still, in Confucianism, a supernatural element. There was this idea of a heavenly being called Tian. Tian, we actually saw it in the quote that we said before. Tianxia means everything under heaven, literally, or the world. But Tian, in that expression, has the concept of almost like a sky god, or sky deity, and it's often confusingly translated in English as heaven, which is very confusing because heaven is a place, right? That's our understanding of it in English. But in Chinese, heaven is a person, or it's a spirit, or a supernatural being, a sky god of some sort. The main characteristic of this sky god, Tian, is that he is very morally concerned. He is concerned with our moral conduct, whether or not we as human beings do right or do wrong. And especially concerned if the king does right or wrong. And so you get, during the Zhou dynasty, this concept called the mandate of heaven, the mandate of Tian, Tianming, which means basically the person ruling was put there by this sky spirit because they were morally just. And if they start not being so morally just, then they need to be removed. And if there are earthquakes, or if there are eclipses, or if there are comets as evil omens, then the king must be unjust and needs to be removed. So there was still a relationship between what was going on in the natural world around you and what was happening socially or morally, especially as it pertained to the king. So there are cosmic undertones to the concept of the Tao, even in Confucianism, but I focus on the word undertone. It was predominantly a social paradigm, right? Social action. A major characteristic of Confucianism, and certainly still a very important characteristic of Chinese thought and action today, is this concept called xiao, or filial piety. If you are a child, you need to take care of your parents. Your parents come first. Elders are the height of society and should be treated with the utmost respect. And so a child needs to put their parent first, needs to take care of their parents. This is still a huge deal in China today. Still very, very important. And in fact, you will often have migrant workers today who will go to the big cities like Beijing or Shanghai and will work there for a year away from their family. And sometimes that also includes their wife or their husband as well as their parents. But every year around February during the Spring Festival or the New Year, the Chinese New Year, they will return home in order to pay their respects and to do the proper rituals pertaining to their family. Yeah. And because of that, travel around that time is crazy in China. It's very, very intense. Justice, this other major concept, we also saw this word in our text at the beginning that we recited, E, which means righteousness or right, being proper, being accurate, being righteous, acting according to what is correct. Pretty much akin to our own notions of that. So that's a fairly accurate translation. Other important ideas, and I'll talk about these in a moment, I have some fun pictures, is ancestor worship. Has anyone heard about that? Popular in China? Ancestor worship? This is an extension of filial piety. Right? So just because your ancestors, just because your grandparents or your great-grandparents pass on, you still have responsibilities to them. You still have to take care of them, and you still have to perform the rituals in order to keep them happy in the afterlife, which according to traditional Chinese belief is not much different than this world. You have to give them money, you have to give them housing, you sometimes have to bribe the underworld officials so that they're taken care of. So there's a lot of activities pertaining to that, and it's all related to filial piety. Your responsibility is not done even after they pass. So we have ancestor worship, kingship, very important as a moral exemplar. This concept of heaven that I talked about. This concept of qi. Has anyone heard of qi before? Yeah. So it's this sort of psychophysical breath or air. It can literally means air today in Chinese that we possess. It's what our breath is consistent of. It also influences our sort of health as well as our mental composition. So sometimes when we have erratic emotions, it's because of an imbalance of qi. Right? We also have this idea in the analects called yin and yang. I'm sure you've all heard of that before. That's very popular, yin and yang. And those are exactly the elements, very dichotomous elements. They can represent hot and cold, or day and night, or dry and wet. Right? All of these are embodied in ourselves and need to be kept balanced. Right? So that's very much integrated with qi. And then finally, this concept of feng shui. Has anyone heard of feng shui? These are some very popular terms today. Yeah, this is basically geomancy. So that whatever the orientation of the furniture in the room, or especially as it pertains to the ancestor worship, where an ancestor's grave is very important. And it has to be in exactly the right place. In Hong Kong, to this day, a lot of cemeteries will be on very bright hillsides because that's perfect. That's the best environment to have to live out the rest of your afterlife, basically, on that hillside. So that's very important, feng shui. All right, so here's some great examples of ancestor worship. What you basically do is you will burn various paper luxuries and objects that the idea is that it will carry on to the afterlife. The smoke will carry on to the other world, and your ancestors, your grandparents, great-grandparents will enjoy those items. So you will have often paper versions of actual physical objects, right? We have this paper car right here. What's next to that are paper mansions. You will have paper alcohol, especially if you have a grandfather or grandmother that loves whiskey. So that's very popular. What I've seen, and I feel bad I didn't bring it today, but it was locked away in my office before I could come. I have paper iPhones. So there you go. You're just talking, Joe, right? So now you can also, you can take it with you. That's the idea. In traditional Chinese belief, you can take it with you. So you can have paper iPhones burnt. And to give a kind of interesting example about that, my girlfriend is half Chinese. Her mother is from Hong Kong, so she's a Hong Konger Chinese, and her father is Caucasian American. But her Chinese grandmother, her popo, recently passed away about 2 years ago. And she went back to pay her respects and to participate in the services, and very elaborate services at that. And she spent time with her Chinese cousins. And they had a conversation one evening during the various events where they wanted to burn a paper iPhone for her. But they were concerned that she wouldn't know how to use it. So they were, yeah, it's important, right? It's hard. iPhones are a bit tricky.
My grandmother would be mad at me.
What are you going to do? Yeah, she's going to be stuck there with this electronic device in the afterlife, and you don't know what to do with it. So they thought, okay, the solution is let's burn another one for her deceased grandfather, and he will teach her how to use it in the afterlife. He will find out how to use it. So they burned 2 iPhones just for that purpose. Yeah, for her gongo, which is her grandfather. So you will have these very nice luxuries that you can have today, and you can have it with you in the afterlife as long as you have ancestors respectful enough and caring enough to burn them for you. And the times to do this are not only during funerals, during the actual aftermath of the passing, but also during special holidays. So there are two major holidays in China for this. One is called Qingming, and it's in the spring, and it's usually the time to clean up the tomb for the family. So you clean it up, you put in fresh flowers, kind of like we would do, and it's actually kind of a nice opportunity for family reunions. It's not a somber event, it's actually a very active event. So all the family gathers traditionally. This is certainly still done in Taiwan and Hong Kong, where the entire family, those living, come together and they have a reunion with those not living. And they all spend that time together, clean up the grave, and celebrate together. Fireworks often go off during that time, that's very important. The other holiday is called the Ghost Festival, Guijie in Chinese, and that's during the August, so in the fall time. And that can be an entire month-long ceremony, depending on how devoted you are. But oftentimes, at the very least, members of the family will burn paper money. It's called hell banknotes, which is very misleading because it's not like your ancestors from hell. It's just that's again poor English, just like heaven, right? It's misunderstood. Where this paper money or spirit money will be burned to give to your ancestors in the afterlife so they can bribe underworld officials, or they can buy whatever the latest gadget is that they want. And so there'll be these nice little kind of buckets where family will burn these on the side of the streets. And this is all during, I think no, it just passed, I'm sorry, just Guijie, or the Ghost Festival, was from mid-August to mid-September this year. It changes a little because it's a lunar versus solar calendar. So that's one thing that you can do. You can also, again, go to the actual tomb where the often cremated remains of your ancestor are interred or buried. Right? Oftentimes, physical burial is not very common in Chinese society. It's cremation and then burial. But another thing you can do is have these memorial centers with photos of your deceased ancestor, and those often are in the city.